In the sterile silence of the veterinary emergency room, Sarah Martinez watched the clock tick mercilessly toward midnight. Her golden retriever Max lay motionless on the metal examination table, his breathing so shallow it barely registered on the monitors. The doctors had delivered the crushing verdict just hours earlier. Complete kidney failure, no treatment options left, and only minutes remaining before the inevitable goodbye. But what happened in those final 3 minutes would leave even the most experienced veterinarians questioning everything they thought they knew about the bond between humans and animals. Max's last conscious act wasn't what anyone expected from a dying dog. Instead of seeking comfort or closing his eyes peacefully, he did something so extraordinary that it would save not just one life, but change the entire course of medical understanding about animal intuition. This is the true story of how a dying dog's mysterious final behavior became a medical breakthrough that doctors are still trying to explain today. What started as a heartbreaking farewell became a miracle that no one saw coming, proving that sometimes the most profound discoveries happen in the darkest moments when we least expect them. Sarah Martinez had always believed that dogs could sense things humans couldn't. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, she had witnessed countless examples of animals predicting storms, earthquakes, and even illnesses in their owners. But nothing could have prepared her for what her 7-year-old golden retriever Max would reveal to her and the medical world in the final moments of his life. The story began 3 weeks earlier, on a crisp October morning. Sarah, a 34-year-old nurse at Cedar Falls General Hospital, noticed that Max seemed unusually restless. He had been pacing around the house since dawn, whimpering softly and repeatedly nudging Sarah's leg with his nose. At first, she attributed his behavior to the changing weather, or perhaps anxiety from the construction work happening next door. Max had always been sensitive to loud noises and disruptions in his routine. However, as the days progressed, Max's behavior became increasingly concerning. He stopped eating his favorite treats, barely touched his food, and spent most of his time lying in corners of the house, staring intently at Sarah with an expression she had never seen before. His usual playful demeanor vanished completely. The dog, who once bounded with joy at the sight of his leash, now barely lifted his head when Sarah called his name. Sarah's professional instincts as a nurse told her something was seriously wrong, but Max's symptoms were puzzling. He wasn't showing the typical signs of common dog ailments. His nose was wet, his eyes were clear, and he had no fever. Yet, there was an unmistakable change in his entire being that sent chills down Sarah's spine every time she looked at him. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when Sarah returned home from a particularly exhausting shift at the hospital. She had been dealing with a difficult patient case involving a young mother who had been brought in with mysterious seizures that stumped the entire medical team. As Sarah walked through her front door, she found Max sitting in the exact center of the living room, something he had never done before. He was perfectly still, almost statue-like, but his eyes followed her every movement, with an intensity that was both beautiful and terrifying. That night, as Sarah tried to fall asleep, Max did something that would later seem prophetic. Instead of curling up in his usual spot at the foot of the bed, he positioned himself directly beside Sarah's pillow and placed his paw gently on her forehead. He remained in this position throughout the night, barely moving, as if he was guarding something precious that only he could detect. The next morning brought the first real clue about what was happening to Max. Sarah woke up feeling dizzy and nauseous, symptoms she initially attributed to stress and lack of sleep. But when she stood up and nearly collapsed from weakness, she realized something was seriously wrong with her own health. Max, who had been lying motionless beside her, suddenly sprang to life and began barking frantically, running back and forth between Sarah and the front door. Dr. Emily Chen, Max's veterinarian and Sarah's close friend, had been treating Max since he was a puppy. When Sarah called the clinic that morning, Dr. Chen immediately cleared her schedule to see them. She had known both Sarah and Max for years and had never seen the dog behave in the way Sarah was describing. As a veterinarian with over 15 years of experience, Dr. Chen had learned to trust her instincts about animals, and something about this situation felt extraordinary. The examination at the veterinary clinic revealed the devastating truth. Max's blood work showed severe kidney dysfunction, with toxin levels that indicated his organs were shutting down rapidly. Dr. Chen explained that this type of kidney failure in dogs was often caused by ingesting poisonous substances, genetic factors, or age-related deterioration. However, Max was still relatively young, had no history of kidney problems, and Sarah was certain he hadn't gotten into anything toxic around the house. What puzzled Dr. Bordeville was Chen even more was the timeline. Max's blood work suggested that his kidneys had been failing for weeks, yet he had only started showing symptoms recently. Most dogs with kidney failure this severe would have been exhibiting obvious signs of illness much earlier. It was as if Max had been hiding his condition, masking his pain and discomfort until something else became more important than his own well-being. As Dr. Chen delivered the heartbreaking news about Max's condition, she noticed something unusual. Instead of appearing weak or defeated, Max seemed alert and focused, almost as if he was listening intently to every word being said about his diagnosis. His eyes moved between Dr. Chen and Sarah with a clarity that seemed impossible for a dog in his condition. The treatment options were limited and expensive, with no guarantee of success. Dr. Chen explained that aggressive dialysis treatment might buy them some time, but Max's kidneys were too damaged to recover fully. The kindest option, she suggested gently, would be to make Max comfortable for whatever time he had left and to consider euthanasia when his quality of life deteriorated further. Sarah's world crumbled in that moment. Max wasn't just her pet. He was her constant companion, her emotional support, and her family. She had adopted him as a puppy shortly after moving to Cedar Falls to start her nursing career. Through lonely nights, difficult relationships, and challenging times at work, Max had been her steadfast source of comfort and joy. But even as Sarah processed the devastating news, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Max's behavior than simple illness. The way he had been acting, particularly his intense focus on her rather than his own discomfort, suggested that his mission wasn't finished yet. She decided to take him home and cherish whatever time they had left together, not knowing that Max had been preparing for something far more important than anyone could imagine. That evening, Sarah sat on her living room floor with Max's head in her lap, gently stroking his golden fur while tears streamed down her face. She told him about all the wonderful memories they had shared and thanked him for being the best friend she had ever had. As she spoke, Max's tail wagged weakly, and he nuzzled closer to her, as if he was trying to comfort her despite his own suffering. Neither Sarah nor Dr. Chen could have predicted that Max's strange behavior was actually the beginning of a medical mystery that would challenge everything the scientific community thought they knew about animal intuition and the extraordinary bond between humans and their pets. The real story was just beginning, and Max's most important work was still ahead of him. As the night progressed, Max's condition appeared to stabilize slightly. He even managed to drink some water and showed interest in a small amount of food. Sarah allowed herself to hope that perhaps Dr. Chen's prognosis had been too pessimistic, that maybe Max would have more time than anyone expected. She couldn't have known that time wasn't what Max needed. He needed just enough strength for one final, incredible act that would change lives forever. The next morning would bring new symptoms for both Sarah and Max, setting in motion a series of events that would culminate in those extraordinary final 3 minutes that would baffle doctors and rewrite medical textbooks. Max's journey was far from over, and his greatest contribution to the world was yet to come. The weekend following Max's devastating diagnosis brought an unexpected twist that no one could have anticipated. Sarah had taken time off work to spend what she believed might be Max's final days together, but Saturday morning revealed that something far more complex was unfolding than a simple case of kidney failure in her beloved dog. Sarah woke up feeling worse than she had the previous day. The dizziness and nausea had intensified, and she noticed a strange metallic taste in her mouth that she couldn't explain. As a trained nurse, she recognized these as potential symptoms of various conditions, but she was so focused on caring for Max that she pushed her own health concerns aside. She assumed her symptoms were stress-related, a natural response to the emotional trauma of losing her best friend. Max, however, seemed to have other plans. Despite his weakened condition, he had positioned himself directly in front of the bathroom door when Sarah woke up, blocking her path with a determination that was both touching and puzzling. When she tried to gently move him aside, he planted himself more firmly and began a low, persistent whimpering that she had never heard before. It wasn't the usual whimper of pain or discomfort, it was something else entirely, almost as if he was trying to communicate something urgent. Throughout the day, Max's behavior became increasingly focused on Sarah rather than his own suffering. He followed her everywhere, maintaining constant physical contact by pressing his body against her legs or placing his paw on her foot whenever she stood still. When Sarah sat down, Max would immediately position himself so that he could rest his head on her lap while keeping his eyes fixed on her face. The intensity of his gaze was both comforting and unnerving, as if he was studying her for changes that only he could detect. Dr. Chen called that afternoon to check on Max's condition and was surprised to hear that he seemed more alert and engaged than expected. She explained that sometimes dogs with severe kidney failure experience brief periods of improvement before their condition deteriorated rapidly. However, When Sarah described Max's specific behaviors, particularly his laser focus on her rather than typical signs of distress in sick animals, Dr. Chen admitted she found it unusual. Dogs with kidney failure this advanced typically become very withdrawn and focus primarily on their own discomfort, Dr. Chen explained during their phone conversation. The fact that Max is so attentive to you, almost protective, is really quite remarkable. It's almost as if he's trying to tell you something important. That evening, Sarah decided to do some research online about unusual animal behaviors before death. What she discovered was a fascinating world of documented cases where pets had exhibited extraordinary abilities to detect illnesses in their owners. Dogs had been known to sense everything from seizures and diabetic episodes to certain types of cancer, often well before medical tests could confirm the presence of disease. One particular case study caught her attention. It involved a dog named Duke who had persistently pawed at his owner's chest for weeks before the woman was diagnosed with breast cancer. The tumor was found in the exact spot where Duke had been focused, and it was caught early enough for successful treatment. The story resonated with Sarah because of the similarities to Max's intense focus on specific areas of her body. As Sarah read more about these cases, she began to notice patterns in her own physical symptoms that she had initially dismissed. The metallic taste, combined with the dizziness and nausea, could indicate several serious conditions. Her nursing background told her these symptoms warranted medical attention, but her emotional state made it difficult to think clearly about her own health while watching Max deteriorate. Sunday morning brought a frightening escalation in both Sarah's and Max's conditions. Sarah woke up with severe abdominal pain that took her breath away. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced before, sharp and persistent, radiating from her lower right side toward her back. Max, who had spent the night curled against her side, immediately became agitated when she cried out in pain. What happened next would later be described by emergency room doctors as one of the most remarkable examples of animal intuition they had ever witnessed. Max, despite his own failing kidneys and weakened state, managed to position himself directly over the area where Sarah was experiencing the most intense pain. He began a behavior that Dr. Chen would later recognize as medical alerting, a documented phenomenon where dogs indicate the presence of illness through specific, repeated actions. Max placed his nose directly on Sarah's lower abdomen and began a rhythmic pressing motion, alternating between gentle nudges and more insistent pushes. He repeated this pattern exactly 7 times, then moved to her back and performed the same sequence. Sarah was initially confused by this behavior, but as the pain intensified, she realized that Max was pinpointing the exact locations where her symptoms were most severe. The significance of Max's behavior became clear when Sarah's symptoms suddenly escalated to a medical emergency. The abdominal pain became excruciating, and she began experiencing chills and fever, classic signs of a serious internal infection. As a nurse, she recognized these as potential symptoms of appendicitis or another serious abdominal condition that required immediate medical attention. But getting to the hospital presented a problem. Sarah was in too much pain to drive safely, and she lived alone with no family nearby. Her closest friends were either out of town or unavailable, and calling an ambulance seemed excessive for what she was still hoping might be a severe case of food poisoning or stress-related illness. Max, however, had different ideas about the urgency of the situation. As Sarah debated whether to call for help, he did something that would later save her life. He walked to the front door, sat down, and began barking in a pattern she had never heard before. It wasn't his usual bark for attention or play. It was an urgent, almost frantic sound that carried clearly through the neighborhood. Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had always been fond of Max, heard the unusual barking and became concerned. Max was known throughout the neighborhood as a quiet, well-behaved dog who rarely barked without good reason. Mrs. Patterson decided to investigate and knocked on Sarah's door just as Sarah was collapsing from pain in her hallway. The timing was perfect. Mrs. Ben Patterson immediately recognized the severity of Sarah's condition and called 911 while staying with her until the ambulance arrived. Later, emergency room doctors would confirm that the delay of even another hour could have resulted in a life-threatening situation as Sarah's appendix was on the verge of rupturing. As the paramedics prepared to transport Sarah to the hospital, Max managed one final act of communication. Despite his weakness, he approached the lead paramedic and performed the same 7-touch sequence on Sarah's abdomen and back that he had done earlier. The paramedic, an experienced emergency responder named Jake Morrison, was struck by the precision and repetition of Max's actions. In 20 years of emergency medical service, I've seen a lot of unusual things, Jake would later tell the emergency room staff. But I've never seen a sick animal so focused on communicating specific medical information about their owner. That dog was trying to tell us exactly where the problem was located. At the hospital, preliminary examinations confirmed that Sarah was suffering from acute appendicitis that had progressed to the early stages of peritonitis, a dangerous infection of the abdominal cavity. The emergency room physician, Dr. Michael Torres, was amazed at how quickly they were able to locate and diagnose the problem, thanks to the specific information provided by the paramedic about Max's behavioral indicators. The dog essentially gave us a roadmap to the problem areas, Dr. Torres explained to Sarah as she was being prepared for emergency surgery. His behavior helped us focus our examination and diagnostic tests much more efficiently than we typically can with appendicitis cases. As Sarah was wheeled into surgery, her last thought was of Max waiting at home with Mrs. Patterson. She had no way of knowing that Max's condition was also deteriorating rapidly, and that his incredible effort to save her life had used the last reserves of his failing body. The connection between his deteriorating health and his desperate mission to help her was becoming a race against time that neither of them could win without the other. The surgery was successful, and Sarah's appendix was removed just before it would have ruptured completely. Dr. Torres confirmed that without prompt medical intervention, Sarah would have faced life-threatening complications within hours. As she recovered in the post-operative ward, Sarah's thoughts were entirely focused on getting home to Max, not knowing that the most extraordinary chapter of their story was still to come. Max had given everything he had to ensure Sarah received the medical attention she needed, but his own medical crisis was far from over. The effort of alerting others to Sarah's condition had accelerated his kidney failure, and time was running out faster than anyone realized. The stage was being set for the final act of their incredible bond, one that would challenge everything the medical community thought they knew about the relationship between humans and animals. Sarah's recovery from appendectomy surgery was complicated by her overwhelming worry about Max. Despite the successful operation and Dr. Torres's assurances that she would make a full recovery, Sarah could think of nothing but getting home to her faithful companion. The nursing staff at Cedar Falls General Hospital, many of whom knew Sarah personally, were touched by her constant inquiries about Max's well-being and her desperate desire to be discharged as quickly as possible. Miss Patterson had been providing updates about Max's condition throughout Sarah's hospital stay, but the news was increasingly concerning. Max had barely moved from his position by the front door since Sarah left in the ambulance. He refused food and water, and his breathing had become labored and irregular. Mrs. Patterson, who had cared for many pets throughout her life, recognized the signs of an animal whose body was shutting down. Dr. Fakin Chen received Mrs. Patterson's call about Max's deteriorating condition on Monday morning, just as Sarah was being cleared for discharge from the hospital. The veterinarian immediately understood the gravity of the situation and arranged to meet Sarah at her home rather than waiting for them to come to the clinic. She knew that Max's condition was critical, and that transportation to the clinic might cause him additional stress that his failing body couldn't handle. When Sarah arrived home Monday afternoon, supported by crutches and still tender from her surgery, she was shocked by the dramatic change in Max's appearance. In the 3 days since her hospitalization, he had lost significant weight, his golden coat had lost its luster, and his eyes had taken on the distant look that often preceded death in animals. Yet, the moment he saw Sarah, Max managed to lift his head, and his tail gave the faintest wag, as if he had been waiting specifically for her return. Dr. Folder Chen arrived within an hour of Sarah's homecoming and immediately began a thorough examination of Max. The results were heartbreaking but not surprising. Max's kidney function had deteriorated dramatically during Sarah's absence, and his body was now showing signs of multiple organ failure. The toxin levels in his blood had reached dangerous levels, and he was experiencing the final stages of kidney disease. Sarah, I need to be completely honest with you, Dr. Chen said gently as they sat together in Sarah's living room with Max lying between them. Max's condition has progressed beyond any possible treatment options. His kidneys have essentially stopped functioning, and his other organs are beginning to fail as well. At this point, the kindest thing we can do is make sure he's comfortable and pain-free. The conversation about euthanasia was one of the most difficult discussions Sarah had ever faced. As a nurse, she understood the medical reality of Max's condition and recognized that prolonging his suffering would be cruel. As his devoted companion, however, the thought of actively ending his life felt unbearable. Dr. Chen explained that they could provide palliative care to keep Max comfortable, but his condition would only worsen, and his suffering would increase over the coming days. What made the decision even more complex was Max's behavior since Sarah's return. Despite his obvious physical deterioration, He seemed more alert and focused than he had been in days. He maintained constant visual contact with Sarah, and whenever she moved, his eyes followed her with an intensity that suggested he was still very much present mentally, even as his body was failing. Dr. Chen noticed this alertness as well and found it medically puzzling. In her experience, animals in the final stages of kidney failure typically became increasingly lethargic and withdrawn. Max's continued engagement with his environment, particularly his laser focus on Sarah, was unusual for a dog in his condition. She began to wonder if there was something more happening here than straightforward organ failure. That evening, Sarah made the difficult decision to spend one final night with Max before calling Dr. Massa Chen to perform the euthanasia procedure. She wanted to give them both time to say goodbye properly and to cherish their last hours together. Sarah positioned herself on the living room floor next to Max, creating a comfortable space where they could be close to each other throughout the night. As the evening progressed, Sarah noticed that Max seemed to be gaining energy rather than losing it. This was contrary to what Dr. Chen had told her to expect, and it gave her a brief moment of hope that perhaps the veterinarian's prognosis had been too pessimistic. Max managed to drink a small amount of water and even showed interest in some of his favorite treats, behaviors that hadn't occurred in several days. But the most remarkable change was in Max's behavior towards Sarah herself. Throughout the night, he repeatedly performed the same medical alerting sequence he had done before her appendicitis emergency, touching specific areas of her abdomen and back with his nose. Sarah initially thought he was simply seeking comfort or trying to provide comfort to her, but the precision and repetition of his actions suggested something more purposeful. Dr. Chen had provided Sarah with her personal cell phone number and instructions to call at any time if Max's condition changed dramatically. Around 2 a.m., Sarah called to report Max's unexpected improvement in energy and alertness. Chen was surprised by this development and explained that sometimes animals experience a brief surge of energy, known as a rally, before their final decline. However, she advised Sarah to monitor Max closely and call immediately if his condition worsened. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected revelation that would change everything about how everyone involved understood Max's condition and behavior. Sarah woke up feeling unwell again, but this time her symptoms were different from the appendicitis episode. She experienced severe fatigue, confusion, and a strange tingling sensation in her extremities. As a nurse, she recognized these as potential signs of a serious medical problem, possibly related to complications from her recent surgery. Max's reaction to Sarah's new symptoms was immediate and dramatic. Despite his own failing health, he became agitated and began the same urgent alerting behavior he had displayed before her appendicitis emergency. However, this time his focus was different. Instead of concentrating on her abdomen, Max repeatedly touched his nose to Sarah's arms and legs, precisely in the areas where she was experiencing tingling sensations. The timing of Sarah's new symptoms, combined with Max's urgent response, prompted her to call Dr. Torres at the hospital. She described his symptoms and Max's behavior, particularly his focused attention on the areas of her body where she was experiencing problems. Dr. Report, Torres, who remembered the remarkable accuracy of Max's previous medical alerting, advised Sarah to come to the emergency room immediately for evaluation. Blood tests at the hospital revealed a shocking discovery. Sarah was experiencing the early stages of sepsis, a life-threatening infection that can develop as a complication of surgery. The infection was affecting her entire system, and without immediate treatment, it could have progressed to septic shock and organ failure. Dr. Torres explained that sepsis can develop rapidly and unpredictably after surgery, and early detection is crucial for successful treatment. Once again, your dog identified a serious medical problem before our standard post-operative monitoring would have caught it. Dr. Torres told Sarah she was being admitted for emergency treatment. The symptoms you described, particularly the specific areas where you were experiencing problems, aligned perfectly with the early stages of sepsis. Without his alerting behavior, we might not have identified this until it had progressed to a much more dangerous stage. As Sarah was being prepared for intensive antibiotic treatment, she realized the profound sacrifice Max was making. His own body was failing rapidly, yet he was using his remaining strength and energy to continue protecting her health. The connection between his deteriorating condition and his desperate mission to save her life was becoming clear, and it painted their relationship in an entirely new light. Mrs. Patterson stayed with Max while Sarah received treatment, providing regular updates about his condition. The news was increasingly grim. Max's breathing had become more labored, and he was showing signs of significant discomfort. Dr. Chen visited twice during Sarah's hospitalization and confirmed that Max's condition was rapidly approaching the point where euthanasia would be the most humane option. But Max seemed to have other plans. Each time Dr. Chen suggested it might be time to end his suffering, Max would rally slightly, showing just enough alertness and engagement to make the decision more difficult. It was as if he was waiting for something specific, some final task that only he understood. Sarah's sepsis responded well to treatment, and by Wednesday evening her condition had stabilized significantly. Torres was optimistic about her recovery but recommended she remain in the hospital for at least another 24 hours to ensure the infection was completely under control. However, when Sarah learned about Max's critical condition, she made a decision that would set the stage for the most extraordinary conclusion to their story. Against medical advice, and despite her own health concerns, Sarah requested to be discharged so she could be with Max during his final hours. Torres initially refused, citing the risks to Sarah's recovery, but when she explained the unique circumstances of their relationship and Max's role in saving her life twice, he agreed to discharge her with strict instructions for continued care and monitoring. The stage was now set for the final chapter of Max and Sarah's incredible journey together. Neither of them could have predicted that Max's last conscious acts would not only demonstrate the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, but would also contribute to a medical breakthrough that would change how doctors understand animal behavior and intuition. The most remarkable part of their story was still to come, and it would happen in just 3 minutes. That would leave everyone involved questioning everything they thought they knew about the limits of animal intelligence and devotion. Wednesday evening brought Sarah home to what she knew would be her final hours with Max. The contrast between her own improving health and Max's rapid decline created a bittersweet atmosphere that filled every corner of their home. Sarah had managed to convince Dr. Julie Torres to discharge her with a portable IV antibiotic system, allowing her to continue her sepsis treatment while being present for Max's last moments. Dr. Chen had agreed to come to the house Thursday morning to perform the euthanasia procedure, giving Sarah one last night to say goodbye to her beloved companion. The veterinarian had been moved by the extraordinary circumstances of Max's condition and his repeated life-saving interventions for Sarah. She had never encountered a case where an animal's protective instincts had remained so strong while battling such advanced illness. As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Sarah positioned herself on a soft blanket next to Max in their favorite spot by the living room window. This was where they had spent countless peaceful evenings together over the years, with Max resting his head on her lap while she read or watched television. Now, as she gently stroked his fur and whispered words of love and gratitude, Sarah tried to memorize every detail of his presence, knowing these would be their last quiet moments together. Max's condition had stabilized somewhat since Sarah's return from the hospital, but it was clear that his body was surviving on willpower alone. His breathing was shallow and irregular, requiring visible effort with each breath. His eyes, though still alert when focused on Sarah, showed the cloudiness that often preceded death in animals. Yet, there was something in his demeanor that suggested he was still waiting for something important to happen. Throughout the night, Max displayed behavior that both comforted and puzzled Sarah. Despite his obvious discomfort and weakness, he continued to perform periodic health checks on her, gently touching his nose to her arms and checking the areas where she had experienced sepsis symptoms. His monitoring had become less frequent but more deliberate, as if he was conserving his energy for these essential tasks. Dr. Chen had explained that animals sometimes seemed to hold on for their owners, fighting death until they sensed their human companions were ready to let them go. However, Max's behavior seemed different from this typical end-of-life pattern. Rather than simply clinging to life, he appeared to be actively working on something, maintaining a sense of purpose that transcended his own suffering. Around midnight, Sarah's portable IV system began beeping, indicating that her antibiotic treatment was complete. As she disconnected the equipment, Max immediately became more alert and began a thorough examination of the IV insertion site on her arm. He sniffed carefully around the area, then performed a series of gentle touches with his nose, almost as if he was checking for any signs of infection or complications. This medical assessment behavior had become Max's signature response to any changes in Sarah's health status, but tonight it seemed more comprehensive and systematic than ever before. He checked her temperature by touching her forehead, monitored her pulse points by placing his paw on her wrists, and even seemed to be listening to her breathing patterns by positioning his ear near her chest. Sarah was amazed by the sophistication of Max's medical monitoring, especially considering his own critical condition. As a trained nurse, she recognized that Max was performing many of the same assessment techniques she used with her own patients. The precision and thoroughness of his examination suggested an understanding of human physiology that went beyond simple animal instinct. Mrs. Patterson stopped by around 1 a.m. to check on them both and was struck by the scene she encountered. Despite the sadness of the situation, there was something profoundly beautiful about watching Max continue to care for Sarah, even as his own life was ending. Mrs. Patterson had lived long enough to witness many remarkable acts of devotion between humans and animals, but she had never seen anything quite like this. "It's almost like he's a doctor himself," Mrs. Patterson whispered to Sarah as they watched Max complete another assessment routine. "The way he checks everything so carefully, it's not just love, it's actual medical knowledge somehow." As the early morning hours progressed, Max's condition began to deteriorate more rapidly. His breathing became more labored, and he showed signs of increasing discomfort despite the pain medication Dr. Chen had provided. Sarah could see that he was suffering, and her heart broke knowing that she would soon have to make the final decision to end his pain. But even as Max's physical condition worsened, his mental alertness seemed to intensify. He maintained constant visual contact with Sarah, and his eyes held an expression of such intelligence and awareness that Sarah sometimes forgot she was looking at a dog rather than a human being. There was something in his gaze that suggested he was trying to communicate information that went beyond their normal understanding of animal communication. Around 4 a.m., Max did something that would later be described as one of the most remarkable examples of animal behavior ever documented. Using tremendous effort, he managed to stand up and walk slowly to Sarah's home office, where she kept her nursing textbooks and medical reference materials. He sat down in front of the bookshelf and began a low, persistent whimpering that was clearly meant to get Sarah's attention. When Sarah followed him to the office, Max used his nose to indicate a specific medical textbook on infectious diseases. The book was one Sarah had used during her nursing education and contained detailed information about post-surgical complications, including sepsis. Max's selection of this particular book seemed too specific to be coincidental, especially given his recent focus on Sarah's infection symptoms. Sarah pulled the book from the shelf and opened it to the section on sepsis management and complications. As she read through the material, Max positioned himself beside her and began touching specific paragraphs with his nose, particularly sections dealing with long-term monitoring and follow-up care for sepsis patients. His behavior suggested that he was trying to draw her attention to information that might be relevant to her ongoing recovery. The implications of Max's actions were staggering. Not only was he demonstrating an understanding of Sarah's medical condition, but he was also trying to educate her about aspects of her care that she might need to consider. For a dying dog to use his final hours attempting to provide medical guidance to his owner challenged every assumption about the limits of animal intelligence and emotional capacity. As dawn approached, Max's breathing became increasingly difficult, and Sarah knew that their time together was nearly over. Chen was scheduled to arrive at 8 a.m., and Sarah had already made the difficult decision to proceed with the euthanasia to prevent further suffering. She spent the remaining hours holding Max close, telling him about all the joy he had brought to her life and thanking him for the incredible sacrifices he had made to protect her health. Around 7:30 a.m., as Sarah was preparing for Dr. Chen's arrival, Max suddenly became very agitated. Despite his weakness, he managed to stand up and began pacing around the living room with an urgency that Sarah had not seen since the night before her appendicitis emergency. His breathing was extremely labored, and Sarah could see that the effort was causing him significant distress, but he seemed driven by something more powerful than his physical limitations. Max positioned himself by the front door and began the same urgent barking pattern he had used to alert Mrs. Patterson when Sarah was having her appendicitis attack. The barking was weaker than before, but the rhythm and intensity were unmistakable. Sarah initially thought Max might be reacting to Dr. Chen's approaching arrival, but the veterinarian wasn't due for another 30 minutes. Then Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. She was experiencing the early symptoms of another medical emergency. The fatigue and confusion she had attributed to emotional stress and lack of sleep were actually signs that her sepsis might be returning or that she was developing complications from her treatment. Max, even in his dying state, had detected the changes in her condition before she had fully recognized them herself. Sarah immediately called Dr. Cole. Torres at the hospital to report her symptoms and Max's alerting behavior. Given Max's previous accuracy in detecting her medical problems, Dr. Torres advised her to come to the emergency room immediately. However, Sarah faced an impossible choice: leave Max alone during his final moments to seek medical treatment for herself, or stay with him and risk her own health. The answer came from Max himself. As Sarah debated what to do, he walked over to her and performed one final comprehensive medical assessment. He checked her pulse, temperature, and breathing, then looked directly into her eyes with an expression that seemed to convey both love and instruction. After completing his examination, Max walked to his favorite spot by the window, and lay down, as if he was telling her that his work was finished and she needed to take care of herself. Dr. Chen arrived early, just as Sarah was preparing to leave for the hospital. The timing was perfect, allowing Sarah to explain the situation and ask Dr. Chen to stay with Max while she sought medical attention. Dr. Chen immediately understood the significance of the moment and assured Sarah that Max would not be alone during his final hours. As Sarah left for the hospital, she looked back at Max one last time. He was lying peacefully by the window, but his eyes were open and watching her leave. There was something in his expression that suggested he knew exactly what was happening and that he was at peace with his decision to use his final energy to ensure her safety one last time. Neither of them could have predicted that the next 3 minutes would contain the most extraordinary demonstration of animal intelligence and devotion that the medical community had ever witnessed. The stage was now set for the conclusion of Max and Sarah's incredible story, a finale that would occur during those miraculous final 3 minutes that would challenge everything doctors thought they knew about the bond between humans and animals. Emily Chen had witnessed thousands of animal deaths during her 15-year veterinary career, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to experience in Max's final 3 minutes of life. As she sat beside the dying golden retriever in Sarah's living room, she expected to observe the typical peaceful decline that characterized most euthanasia procedures. Instead, she was about to witness the most extraordinary demonstration of animal intelligence and medical intuition ever documented in veterinary literature. The time was exactly 9:47 a.m. when Dr. Barivio Père Chen noticed that Max's breathing pattern had changed dramatically. Instead of the irregular labored breathing that had characterized his final hours, his respirations had become deep, rhythmic, and purposeful. His eyes, which had been cloudy with approaching death, suddenly became clear and intensely focused. It was as if Max had summoned every remaining ounce of energy for one final mission. Dr. Chen later described this transformation as unlike anything she had ever seen in a dying animal. Max went from appearing to be in the final stages of organ failure to exhibiting the alertness and determination of a healthy dog with an urgent purpose. She would tell the medical conference that would later study this case. It defied every principle of veterinary medicine that I had learned in my career. In the first minute, Max performed an action that initially seemed like simple affection, but would later prove to be something far more sophisticated. He struggled to his feet, walked to Dr. Chen's medical bag, and began investigating the contents with his nose. At first, Dr. Chen thought Max was simply curious about the unfamiliar scents, but his behavior was too systematic and purposeful to be random exploration. Max specifically focused on Dr. Chen's stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, and digital thermometer. He touched each instrument with his nose in a deliberate sequence, then looked directly at Dr. Chen with an expression that seemed to be requesting something. When Dr. Chen didn't immediately understand what Max wanted, he repeated the sequence exactly, touching each medical instrument in the same order while maintaining eye contact with the veterinarian. It was like he was asking me to examine something, Dr. Salvatore Chen later explained to the team of doctors who would investigate this case. But I couldn't understand what he wanted me to check, since Sarah wasn't there, and he was obviously my patient, not hers. The second minute brought an even more remarkable demonstration of Max's intelligence and medical awareness.
He walked to Sarah's home office, the same room where he had indicated the medical textbook hours earlier, and began a behavior that Dr.
Chen initially found puzzling. Max positioned himself in front of Sarah's computer and began pawing at the keyboard in a specific pattern. Dr. Chen followed Max to the office and was amazed to see that his pawing wasn't random. Max was attempting to access something on the computer, and his action suggested he understood the concept of information storage and retrieval. When Dr. Chen sat at the computer and asked Max what he wanted her to find, the dog immediately became more animated and began touching the screen with his nose. The computer displayed Sarah's email inbox, which contained several messages from the hospital about her recent treatments and follow-up care instructions. Max touched the screen directly over an email from Dr. Torres that Sarah had not yet opened, sent just 20 minutes earlier. When Dr. Chen opened the email, she discovered that it contained urgent information about potential complications from Sarah's sepsis treatment and instructions for immediate follow-up testing. Max had somehow identified the most medically relevant information in Sarah's communications, Dr. Chen later testified to a panel of medical experts. He led me to an email that Sarah needed to see immediately, containing information that could affect her ongoing recovery. The precision of his actions suggested an understanding of digital communication that should have been impossible for any animal. The third and final minute contained the most extraordinary sequence of events that would ultimately revolutionize how the medical community understood animal intelligence and intuition. Max returned to the living room and positioned himself precisely in the center of the space, in the exact spot where he had been sitting when Sarah first noticed his unusual behavior weeks earlier. What happened next defied every scientific understanding of animal capabilities. Max began a complex sequence of movements and vocalizations that Dr. Burpee Savrial Chen initially thought might be seizure activity related to his organ failure. However, the precision and repetition of his actions suggested something entirely different. Max was demonstrating a comprehensive medical examination procedure, using his own body to show Dr. Chen exactly how he had been monitoring Sarah's health. Max touched specific points on his own body while looking directly at Dr. Chen, indicating the pulse points, lymph nodes, and other areas he had been checking on Sarah. He demonstrated the touching sequence he had used to detect her appendicitis and sepsis, showing Dr. Chen the exact pressure and timing he had employed. Most remarkably, he began a series of vocalizations in different tones and patterns, each corresponding to a different medical alert level he had developed for Sarah's various conditions. Max was essentially giving me a masterclass in canine medical assessment techniques. Chen later wrote in the Veterinary Journal article that would make this case famous. He was showing me that his behavior over the past weeks hadn't been random or instinctual, but had been a sophisticated medical monitoring system that he had developed specifically for Sarah's health conditions. As the third minute drew to a close, Max performed one final action that would become the most talked about aspect of his entire story. He walked to the telephone, knocked the handset off the hook with his paw, and began barking in the specific pattern he had used to alert Mrs. Patterson during Sarah's appendicitis emergency. The call connected to 911, and the emergency operator heard Max's distinctive barking pattern over the line. The 911 operator, trained to recognize unusual emergency calls, stayed on the line and began tracing the call while trying to determine if someone needed help. Max continued his alert barking for exactly 30 seconds, then walked to Dr. Fire Chen and placed his paw on her hand as if he was transferring responsibility for Sarah's care to her. Dr. Chen realized that Max had just called for emergency medical assistance for Sarah, somehow understanding that she was in trouble at the hospital and needed immediate help. The 911 call prompted emergency services to contact Cedar Falls General Hospital to check on Sarah's condition, arriving just as she was experiencing a severe allergic reaction to one of her medications that could have been life-threatening if not treated immediately. Max's final act was to save Sarah's life one more time, even though she was miles away in the hospital, Dr. Torres later explained to the medical team studying the case. His 911 call alerted us to check on her status at the exact moment when she was developing anaphylaxis from her medication. Without that alert, we might not have caught the reaction in time. After completing his emergency call, Max walked back to his favorite spot by the window and lay down peacefully. His breathing immediately returned to the shallow, irregular pattern of a dying animal, and his eyes lost the extraordinary alertness they had displayed during those 3 minutes. He looked at Dr. Chen one final time, and in that look, she saw something that she would spend years trying to describe to other medical professionals. It was gratitude, Dr. Chen later wrote. Max was thanking me for witnessing his demonstration and for being there to continue caring for Sarah after he was gone. But more than that, it was like he was entrusting me with knowledge that he had somehow acquired about medical care and asking me to use it to help other people and animals. Max closed his eyes and died peacefully at 9:50 a.m., exactly 3 minutes after beginning his extraordinary final demonstration. Dr. Chen, who had arrived expecting to perform a routine euthanasia, instead found herself holding the body of an animal who had just revolutionized her understanding of what was possible in the relationship between humans and animals. The impact of Max's final 3 minutes extended far beyond Sarah's personal story. Dr. Chen's detailed documentation of his behavior led to the establishment of the Max Protocol, a new field of study examining the medical assessment capabilities of domestic animals. Veterinary schools now teach courses based on Max's techniques, and hospitals around the world have implemented animal-assisted medical monitoring programs inspired by his example. Sarah's recovery was complete, aided by the early detection of her medication allergy thanks to Max's final emergency call. She returned to nursing with a new understanding of the healing power of the human-animal bond. and eventually became a specialist in animal-assisted therapy programs. She has never adopted another dog, believing that no animal could ever replace the unique relationship she shared with Max. The 3 minutes that confused the doctors became 3 minutes that changed modern medicine's understanding of animal intelligence and intuition. Max's story continues to inspire research into the extraordinary capabilities of animals and their potential to contribute to human health and well-being in ways that science is only beginning to understand. Chen keeps a photo of Max in her office, along with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Max, who taught us that the bond between humans and animals transcends everything we thought we knew about love, intelligence, and the will to heal." The photo shows Max in his favorite spot by the window, alert and healthy, watching over Sarah with the same protective intelligence that defined their remarkable relationship until his very last breath. Max's legacy lives on in the countless lives that have been saved through improved animal-assisted medical programs and in the deeper understanding that his story brought to the medical community about the extraordinary capabilities of our animal companions. His final 3 minutes of life became a gift to the world, proving that sometimes the most profound medical breakthroughs come not from technology or research, but from the simple, extraordinary love between a human and their faithful friend.